It's a golden age for CPUs right now, with budget models from both Intel and AMD that can match or even beat top-end ones from just a couple of years ago. Of course, budget is a relative term, and not everyone can afford to buy brand new. Thankfully, it's also a golden age for second-hand CPUs, with high core count chips with decent performance available for bargain prices. Here are 3 great Xeons for gaming that can be bought on AliExpress for about $10 each. Intel's Xeon branding is mostly reserved for CPUs intended for business use. You often find them in workstations, servers, and other boring and expensive machines, and their model numbers are borderline unintelligible. Once you find yourself a good source of information about Xeons, however, I recommend Tech Power Up or Intel's own ARC website. You'll start to see that some Xeons actually have a lot in common with chips in the i3, i5, and i7 lineups you're probably more familiar with. There are differences, of course. Some of them use different sockets and motherboards to the more conventional CPUs. They rarely have unlocked multipliers for overclocking, and most importantly, they're a hell of a lot cheaper. This low price isn't because they're poor quality or scams, but because they're just not wanted anymore. Companies and institutions that acquire Xeon-based machines often do so by leasing them, and at the end of the lease agreement, these workstations and servers get shipped back to the supplier and replaced with new models. If the lease is long enough, the hardware itself is probably pretty obsolete by that point, and newer, more efficient CPUs will be available. This, plus the sheer number of computers involved, means that many of the components that are still useful get sold off in bulk or even thrown away. Right now, the Venn diagram of old enough to be considered e-waste, new enough to be interesting to us, and so common it's suspiciously cheap, crosses over on Haswell EP. This is the codename for a series of CPUs made in 2014 and 2015 for Socket 2011 v3, and includes models with as few as 4 and as many as 18 cores. Haswell EP has decent performance for its clock speeds, isn't missing any major instruction sets, and is compatible with DDR4 memory, which at the time of writing is still extremely common and cheap on both the new and used markets. Paired with a recycled X99 motherboard from brands like Machinist, or a retired workstation like this Lenovo, these can actually be great options for those on a tight budget, but who still need something with some gaming chops. The 3 CPUs I'm testing in this video are each available for under £10, or about $11 on AliExpress. And if you're lucky, you may find similar deals on your local eBay. The cheapest of the 3 is the E5-1620V3, a quad-core 8-thread model with a base clock of 3.5 and boost of 3.6 GHz. While this isn't very high spec, either in the range of CPUs for the socket or in the context of modern gaming, it is frequently available in cheap old Dell, Lenovo and HP workstations and can be bought on its own for about £4 to £5. I just spent 3 times as much on a jumbo-sized tube of Arctic MX4. The second chip, and the one that's probably most interesting for pure gaming, is the E5-1650V3. This is a not very subtle rebrand of the i7-5930K, with 6 cores, 12 threads, a 3.5 GHz base and 3.8 GHz boost clock. Unlike most other Xeons, the 1650V3 has multiplier-based overclocking, so a compatible motherboard can get this thing running at in excess of 4 GHz. A word of warning, however, although the £9 price tag might be attractive, these Haswell EP chips are pretty inefficient, and are even more so once you start pushing the clock speeds. Consult the bill payer first. Finally, the E5-2640V3 might sound confusing because it has a 2 at the start instead of a 1. That doesn't make it incompatible, it just means it was meant to work in a dual socket system. Likewise, Xeon 4000s are made to work in 4s. A 2000 series works just as well on the same motherboards as the 1600s, and is often cheaper than a 1600 series because they tend to have lower power limits and therefore lower clock speeds. They also all have locked multipliers, so are somewhat less capable from a gaming perspective. The 2640V3 has 8 cores and 16 threads, and while it has a turbo of up to 3.4 GHz, its base clock is a mere 2.6. On the positive side, it costs about £8, or 2/3 of a 20-gram tube of MX4. I've tested these three CPUs using a Gigabyte X99 gaming motherboard, 32GB of quad-channel SK Hynix ECC RAM, borrowed from a Lenovo P500, and a Radeon RX 6900 XT. The RAM frequency depends on the CPU being used. It's 2133 for the 1620 and 1650, and 1866 for the 2640, though being quad-channel does mean that its effective clock speed is much higher. The RX 6900 XT was chosen because it's a Radeon, and so works better with older and less powerful CPUs, and because it won't be a bottleneck. It's not a specific recommendation. You might find that these CPUs are better paired with something like an RX 6700 XT. The motherboard can overclock using the multiplier, so of course I had a go at the 1650 V3 running at 4.5 GHz, and I've included the numbers alongside the stock ones, though again, it's not a recommendation. The CPU jumps from using about 160 watts under load to a whopping 250 watts. Finally, I'm using the Inspector tool to disable Spectre and Meltdown protection. These are a pair of security flaws in older CPUs, primarily affecting Intels. The security update, which patches these vulnerabilities, also affects CPU performance, and Inspector is a very simple and reversible tool to disable those protections and regain that lost performance. Inspector is obviously only to be used with the understanding that it may make your PC vulnerable to attack. Starting with Valorant, a game which is very lightweight on graphics cards, but can be quite heavy on the CPUs. Valorant likes clock speeds and level 3 cache over cores, so while the 1620 should be a good option on paper, in reality it's still the worst performer of the three. That still means for an excellent 174 FPS on average, with lows close to 90. The 2640 does beat this average by about 50 FPS, but even that is still behind the 1650. The 6-core just surpasses the 8-core at 235 FPS at stock speeds and jumps all the way up to 280 when overclocked. Counter-Strike 2 kinda treads the same ground as Valorant, but I haven't decided which one I want to drop yet. Like Valorant, the 1620 comes in last place, averaging 135 FPS. The 2640's margin is now only about 20 FPS, and minimums are almost identical. The 1650 comes in first, beating the 2640 by about 20 FPS at stock and 35 FPS at 4.5 GHz. Most importantly, the OC result sees 1% past 100 FPS and 0.1s over 70. Fortnite just had an update halfway through my testing, and this new OG update seems to have rolled back a lot of the more demanding aspects of the game. This means performance is radically better. It also invalidates all my past testing, so I just have the 3 Xeons in this chart. This is a rare win for the 2640 in a DX11 game, though it's only by 0.7 FPS, and therefore is more of a tie than anything. It loses in 1% and 0.1% lows by a larger margin, but still close enough to be practically identical. The 1620 holds up remarkably well, though it loses some steam in the 0.1s. Call of Duty Warzone is a far more intensive game on PCs than the others featured so far, and it actually makes it hard to recommend two of the CPUs in this test. The 1620 and 2640 V3 both fall at the 75 FPS mark, but 1% and 0.1% lows are only in the high 40s and 30s respectively. The 1650, on the other hand, works out much better even at stock clocks, with averages at nearly 90 FPS and 1% lows over 60. Overclocked, it actually competes with more modern desktop chips like the i7 6700K and Ryzen 3 3100, though it's using a lot more power in the process. Of the 3 CPUs, I'd say only 2 are good enough for Starfield. The 1620 is capable of over 30 FPS on average while walking through New Atlantis, but 1% and 0.1% lows are, well, low. The 6 and 8 core CPUs can beat 30 FPS 99% of the time, with averages in the mid-40s. Again, the 1650 takes a slight win over the 2640, which is extended by a further 6 FPS when overclocked. I test Cyberpunk 2077 both with and without ray tracing, though I have a sneaking suspicion that most of you thinking of buying one of these Xeons don't intend to pair it with a high-end RTX card. The standard run has the 1620 breaking 60 on average, but lows bring it closer to 30 FPS, whereas both of the others pass 80 FPS averages but fall short of a 60 FPS 1% low. When overclocked, the 1650 can almost achieve that target, and averages are a whopping 95 FPS. Turning RT on sees another small win for the 2640, with 1% lows over 30 FPS, whereas the 1650 falls just under the mark. Once more, the 900 MHz overclock gives the 1650 a roughly 10% uplift. Once again, it's a two-horse race in The Last of Us. The 2640 falls a little behind the 1650 overall, winning only by 3 frames at 1% lows, but losing out otherwise. The 1620 is pretty rough going, with 1% lows failing to make 30 FPS, making it hard to recommend for this particular title. Overclocking the 1650 is also hard to recommend, as lows don't really benefit, and averages don't increase by a large enough margin to actually improve anything. Jedi Survivor is a pretty big win for the 1650. If any result can truly be seen as a win in this game notorious for its stutter, the 73 FPS average on the 1650 may be almost 7 FPS higher than the 2640, but the 1% lows are practically neck and neck between the two. Overclocking the 1650 once more increases performance by about 10% and has a more noticeable effect on 1% lows. As for the 1620, again, it's pretty rough going for this game, and I'd skip it if I owned this CPU. Flight Simulator is one simulation where using budget CPUs not only has a performance impact, but also has a penalty on image quality. Lower-end CPUs affect the distance at which high-end detail meshes pop in, and at stock settings, all of these chips leave something to be desired in that regard. In terms of straight FPS, the 1650 is once more a winner, though by a pretty small margin. Overclocking, however, has a massive impact, causing a 20% climb in average FPS. The Civ 6 AI benchmark once more is a close race between the 1650 and 2640, and one that the 6-core wins by a small margin. The overclock can bring the 1650 level with an overclocked i7 6700K, though if anything, this CPU is even less efficient than that one. The quad-core Xeon only manages an average turn time of 7.51 seconds, which is equal to an i5 4590K running at 4.5 GHz, and slightly faster than a modern mobile i9. One final thing worth noting is that it's possible to perform a turbo unlock on some of the recycled AliExpress motherboards. Most Xeons have different turbo frequencies depending on how many cores are being utilised, with single cores boosting higher than all-core workloads. This mod can give up to a couple hundred megahertz higher clock speeds, and could be extremely helpful for CPUs like the 2640, but is also something of a risky procedure and not something I'd recommend for people who aren't experienced in BIOS flashing. I'll include a link below to a video from Meerkonst Hardware, who is YouTube's resident X99 turbo unlocking guy. My Gigabyte board has proven quite reluctant to allow me to mod the BIOS, but to give you an idea of how much performance gain you should expect, I've rerun the 1650 V3 tests, overclocked to 3.8 GHz, which is the maximum all-core turbo that a modded setup could achieve. If you're at all concerned about BIOS modding, I don't think you're missing out on much in the case of the 1650. I think the 2640 with the CPU I'd like to see running at full potential, as right now it only gets to 2.8 GHz on all cores, whereas it has the potential to gain a massive 600 MHz from the mod. If you can't or don't want to attempt the Turbo Unlock mod, the E5-2667V3 is an 8-core CPU that can achieve 3.4 GHz on all cores without modding. However, it does cost about twice as much. In conclusion, it's pretty close between the 1650 V3 and the 2640 V3, and maybe the productivity benchmarks will sway it for you, but unless you're willing and able to mod your BIOS, I'd say the 1650 is the better choice. Of course, if you have a slightly higher budget, there are tons more weird and wild CPUs for this socket, so let me know in the comments which you'd like to see me compare next. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.